The silence that morning was heavier than the polished marble floors of the consulate's grand entrance, a silence that swallowed the hopeful whispers of those clutching their documents like lifelines. For Omar al-Hassan, a man whose wealth flowed like oil across continents, from Dubai's gleaming towers to Manhattan's financial districts, rejection had never darkened his carefully planned path. Yet here he stood in the heart of New York City, his shoulders carrying the weight of a world that suddenly saw him as nothing more than another Arab face seeking American soil. His investment portfolio, worth millions in cryptocurrency and blue-chip stocks, meant nothing to the cold eyes behind the Visa counter. I don't know where you're listening from right now. Maybe you're mopping the floors of a corporate building as the city sleeps, checking security cameras in the early hours, or turning the locks on doors that guard other people's dreams. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise you, today's story will reach into your chest and squeeze your heart until you remember what it feels like to be truly seen. In that same building, moving like a shadow between the polished corridors, worked another Omar Castellanos, a janitor whose weathered hands had cleaned these floors for 15 years. His uniform was faded blue, his name tag barely readable, and his presence so familiar it had become invisible. The diplomats who rushed past him discussing billion-dollar trade agreements never noticed how his dark eyes held decades of quiet observation, how his careful movements spoke of a dignity that no amount of wealth could purchase. While millionaires discussed their stock market gains and cryptocurrency investments in the waiting area, Omar pushed his cart through their conversations, collecting their discarded coffee cups and the fragments of their careless words. The consulate on East 49th Street buzzed with the constant hum of power and ambition. Omar Castellanos knew every corner of this building, from the basement storage rooms where old files gathered dust, to the executive floors where decisions worth millions of dollars were made over imported coffee. His day began at 5 in the morning, when Manhattan still slept, and the building belonged to him and the security guards who nodded respectfully as he passed. He would unlock each floor methodically, his keys jingling softly in the pre-dawn darkness, preparing the stage for another day of diplomatic theater. The wealthy visitors who passed through these halls never saw him, not really. To them, he was part of the building's furniture, useful but unremarkable. They spoke freely around him, their voices carrying secrets that would shake governments, discussing investments in gold futures and oil derivatives as if he were deaf to their words. But Omar's mind was sharp as the morning air outside, cataloging every conversation, every slight, every moment of humanity that flickered between the marble walls. His memory was a vault more secure than any bank where these millionaires kept their fortunes. That Tuesday morning carried a tension as thick as the humidity rising from the city streets below. Omar Castellanos noticed it first in the way the visa officer David Brennan adjusted his tie with nervous precision. Brennan was a man who wore his ambition like an expensive suit, visible from across the room. His corner office displayed his diplomas like trophies, and his desk held photos of himself shaking hands with senators and business leaders. He had built his career on the careful cultivation of the right connections, and his salary, while modest compared to the millionaires he served, afforded him a comfortable Manhattan lifestyle, complete with a Doorman building and weekend trips to the Hamptons. When Omar al-Hassan approached the counter that morning, carrying documents that represented his extensive business empire, real estate holdings worth hundreds of millions, investment portfolios spanning 3 continents, and letters of recommendation from Fortune 500 CEOs, Omar Castellanos paused in his dusting. Something in the air shifted, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks over Central Park. The wealthy visitor's attire spoke of old money and new success, a custom Italian suit, Swiss watch, and leather briefcase that probably cost more than Omar Castellanos earned in 6 months. Brennan's examination of the documents was perfunctory, his questions sharp and loaded with assumptions. "These business connections in the Middle East," he said, his voice carrying across the marble lobby where Omar Castellanos carefully arranged fresh flowers. "How do we know they're legitimate? The current climate makes it difficult to verify the source of such extensive wealth." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Omar Castellanos felt his chest tighten as he watched the millionaire's face harden with the sting of unspoken accusations. The rejection came swift and brutal, delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that power makes possible. "Your application is denied. The documentation raises too many questions about the origins of your assets and your connections in volatile regions." Omar al-Hassan stood silent, his dignity wrapped around him like armor, but Omar Castellanos saw the flicker of pain that crossed his features, the same look he had seen on countless faces throughout his years in this building, the expression of a man discovering that all his millions couldn't buy him basic respect. As Omar al-Hassan gathered his papers with careful composure, one document fluttered to the floor behind Brennan's desk, a letter from the Secretary of Commerce personally vouching for the businessman's character and his contributions to American Middle Eastern trade relations worth billions in annual revenue. Omar Castellanos, emptying the wastebasket nearby, quietly retrieved the paper and slipped it into his uniform pocket. His weathered fingers recognized the weight of genuine government letterhead, and his years of service had taught him to distinguish between the important and the discarded. The silence that followed Omar al-Hassan's departure was different from the usual hush of the consulate. It was the silence of injustice settling into the building's bones, of prejudice masquerading as procedure. Omar Castellanos continued his work, but something had shifted in his careful routine. For the first time in 15 years, he found himself questioning the nobility of the institution he had served so faithfully, wondering if dignity could survive in a place where wealth and connections mattered less than the color of one's passport or the sound of one's name. The days following the visa rejection unfolded with the deceptive calm of a city in summer, where heat builds slowly beneath cloudless skies until the pressure becomes unbearable. Omar Castellanos moved through his familiar routines, but his movements carried a new weight, like a man walking through water instead of air. He unlocked doors at dawn, his keys catching the first light streaming through the tall windows that overlooked the bustling streets where hot dog vendors were already setting up their carts, and yellow taxis began their daily dance through traffic. The letter in his uniform pocket seemed to burn against his chest as he worked. During his lunch break, sitting on a bench in nearby Bryant Park where office workers hurried past clutching their smartphones and discussing their stock portfolios, Omar carefully read the document that had fallen behind Brennan's desk. The Secretary of Commerce's words were unambiguous. Omar al-Hassan was not only a legitimate businessman, but a crucial bridge between American and Middle Eastern markets, responsible for trade agreements worth over $2 billion annually. His cryptocurrency investments alone had helped stabilize emerging markets during recent financial turbulence. Back in the consulate, Omar Castellanos observed the subtle hierarchies that governed this world of diplomatic privilege. The ambassadors and senior staff occupied the upper floors, their offices appointed with Persian rugs and oil paintings that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Their conversations revolved around investment opportunities, real estate acquisitions, and the kind of wealth management that turned millions into billions. Below them, the visa officers like Brennan wielded their smaller portion of power with the enthusiasm of men who had never held real authority before. The petitioners who visited daily represented a cross-section of global ambition and desperation. Wealthy tech entrepreneurs seeking to expand their Silicon Valley empires, oil executives planning new refineries, cryptocurrency millionaires looking to diversify their portfolios into American real estate, all passed through the same marble lobby where Omar Castellanos had witnessed Omar al-Hassan's humiliation. Some were approved with handshakes and smiles, others left with the same quiet dignity that had marked the Arab businessman's departure. For weeks, Omar Castellanos carried the weight of what he had witnessed and what he knew. His wife, Maria, noticed the change over their dinner of rice and beans in their modest Queens apartment. "You're different, mi amor," she said, studying his face across their small kitchen table. "Something is troubling you." Omar looked out at the distant Manhattan skyline, where lights twinkled like stars in windows that housed fortunes he could barely imagine, and told her about the letter, about the injustice he had witnessed, about feeling invisible while holding the power to make things right. The turning point came on a Thursday evening when Omar was emptying wastebaskets in Brennan's office. The visa officer was on the phone, his feet propped on his desk, speaking to someone about his weekend plans in the Hamptons. "These Middle Eastern types," Brennan laughed into the receiver, "they think money can buy them anything. But we have to be careful about who we let in, especially the ones with all that oil money and cryptocurrency. Too many questions, too many connections that might not look good on the evening news." Omar Castellanos felt something snap inside his chest, a sound like breaking glass in an empty room. He finished his work in silence, but as he prepared to leave that night, he made a decision that would change everything. Instead of filing the Commerce Secretary's letter in the lost documents drawer where it might gather dust forever, he walked to the copy machine and made several copies, tucking them carefully into his jacket pocket alongside the original. The weight of justice, Omar discovered, was heavier than any fortune counted in dollars or cryptocurrency, more valuable than any stock portfolio or real estate empire. For 15 years, he had been invisible, but invisibility, he realized, was also a kind of power, the power to see without being seen, to know without being known, to act without being suspected. The marble floors of the consulate had witnessed his humiliation of being unseen, but they would also witness his quiet revolution of being finally, truly present. The letter in his pocket felt like a key, not just to Omar al-Hassan's vindication, but to his own transformation from shadow to light, from servant to guardian of truth. The city outside continued its relentless pulse. Millions of people pursuing their dreams of wealth and recognition. But inside the quiet consulate, one invisible man prepared to become the most important person in the building. 3 months passed like seasons changing over Manhattan's steel and glass canyons, and the consulate began to experience what the senior staff would later describe as an unusual run of operational difficulties. Documents disappeared from secure filing cabinets only to resurface in the wrong departments. Important phone messages went undelivered. The coffee service that had run flawlessly for years started producing bitter, undrinkable brew that left visiting millionaires and oil executives grimacing over their morning meetings about petroleum futures and cryptocurrency markets. Omar Castellanos continued his work with the same methodical precision he had maintained for 15 years, but his efficiency had developed subtle imperfections that accumulated like interest on unmarked accounts. The security system that monitored the building's most sensitive areas began experiencing technical glitches, cameras that mysteriously malfunctioned during crucial conversations between diplomats discussing billion-dollar arms deals and trade agreements. The pristine marble floors, once spotless, now bore faint streaks that seemed to reappear daily, despite repeated cleaning. David Brennan found his carefully ordered world beginning to fray at the edges. His office, once a monument to bureaucratic precision, became a maze of misplaced files and missed appointments. The wealthy applicants who had once praised his thoroughness now complained about delays in processing their visa applications. A prominent real estate mogul worth 9 figures in Manhattan properties alone stormed out after waiting 3 hours for an appointment that had somehow been double booked. A cryptocurrency entrepreneur who had planned to invest $50 million in American startups canceled his application entirely after his documents were mysteriously lost for 2 weeks. The building's ambassador, Margaret Whitman, began receiving calls from influential donors and political allies questioning the consulate's declining efficiency. These weren't ordinary complaints. They came from people whose names appeared on Forbes lists, whose investment funds controlled enormous portions of the stock market, whose political contributions could determine election outcomes. when a Saudi prince called personally to inquire about the status of his nephew's repeatedly delayed visa application. Ambassador Whitman realized the situation had moved beyond mere administrative inconvenience into potential diplomatic crisis. During this time, Omar Castellanos maintained his invisible presence, arriving each morning at 5 to unlock the building and prepare it for another day of international business. But his routine had evolved to include new patterns of movement through the consulate's corridors. He had discovered that 15 years of faithful service had earned him access to virtually every room in the building, and his presence was so expected that security guards barely glanced at his keyring anymore. The original Commerce Secretary's letter remained safely hidden in his apartment, but the copies had found their way into various strategic locations throughout the building. The breaking point came during a particularly difficult week when 3 separate visa applications from wealthy Middle Eastern businessmen, each representing potential investments worth hundreds of millions in American infrastructure projects, were rejected by Brennan using nearly identical language about suspicious financial connections and unclear business relationships. The rejections seemed to follow a pattern that had nothing to do with the actual documentation provided and everything to do with the applicants' countries of origin and religious backgrounds. Omar Castellanos watched these rejections from his position behind a service cart, noting how Brennan's questions focused not on the legitimate business credentials of the applicants, but on their cultural and political associations. A pharmaceutical executive who had developed breakthrough treatments for childhood diseases was questioned extensively about his mosque attendance. A tech innovator whose artificial intelligence research promised to revolutionize medical diagnosis faced inquiries about his family's political opinions. A green energy entrepreneur whose solar panel innovations could reduce American oil dependence was asked about his connections to potentially problematic regional networks. The injustice of these proceedings burned in Omar's chest like acid, reminding him of his own experiences with discrimination, the comments about his accent, the assumptions about his education, the way powerful people looked through him as if he were transparent. But Omar al-Hassan's case remained the most egregious example of how prejudice could masquerade as policy, how fear could override facts, how racism could hide behind regulations. It was during this period of mounting chaos that Omar made his final preparations. The building's security system, which he had helped install and maintain over the years, held recordings of every significant conversation that had taken place in visa processing areas. His 15 years of faithful service had earned him the trust of IT personnel who had long ago stopped monitoring his access to backup systems and archived files. Like a patient gardener tending seeds that would eventually bloom into justice, Omar began assembling the evidence that would transform the consulate from a place of casual prejudice into an institution accountable for its actions. The city outside continued its relentless pursuit of wealth and power, stock markets rising and falling, cryptocurrency values fluctuating like tides, real estate fortunes being made and lost in Manhattan's luxury towers. But inside the consulate, an invisible janitor was preparing to prove that the most valuable currency in any building was truth, and that sometimes the most powerful person in any room was the one nobody bothered to see. The corruption that had infected the visa department began to metastasize through the consulate like a disease spreading through a body's bloodstream. Ambassador Whitman, whose career had been built on maintaining the delicate relationships between American business interests and international partners, found herself fielding increasingly hostile calls from wealth management firms whose clients were being denied visas despite their enormous potential contributions to the American economy. The Qatar Investment Authority, managing over $400 billion in assets, threatened to reconsider their American real estate acquisitions after one of their executives was refused entry. A consortium of cryptocurrency billionaires planning to establish blockchain research centers in Silicon Valley began exploring Canadian alternatives instead. The State Department launched a quiet investigation into the consulate's operations, focusing particularly on the visa department's unusual rejection rates for Middle Eastern applicants. Internal auditors arrived unannounced, their presence creating a tension that seemed to seep through the building's ventilation system like an invisible gas. David Brennan, once confident in his position, began showing signs of stress that even his expensive suits and careful grooming couldn't hide. His hands shook slightly when handling documents, and his usual arrogant efficiency gave way to nervous double-checking of decisions he had once made with casual certainty. During this period of institutional upheaval, Omar Castellanos maintained his quiet presence, moving through the corridors like a ghost with cleaning supplies. But his movements had taken on a new purpose. Guided by the knowledge that justice sometimes required patience measured in months rather than moments. The Commerce Secretary's letter, the document that could unravel Brennan's entire pattern of discrimination, remained safely hidden, but Omar had begun creating a more comprehensive archive of the consulate's systemic failures. His access to the building's communication systems, earned through 15 years of trusted service, allowed him to observe the internal damage control efforts. Senior staff sent encrypted messages discussing damage limitation strategies. Legal advisors recommended reviewing all recent visa denials. Public relations consultants suggested preparing explanations for why qualified applicants with legitimate business interests were being rejected at rates significantly higher than statistical norms would predict. The investigation's scope expanded when it became clear that Brennan's discriminatory practices had cost American businesses billions of dollars in lost investment opportunities. The pharmaceutical executive whose visa had been denied possessed patents worth over $2 billion that could have been developed in American research facilities. The artificial intelligence researcher had been courted by Chinese companies offering unlimited funding for his breakthrough medical diagnostic systems. The solar energy entrepreneur had taken his revolutionary panel technology to German manufacturers instead of the Michigan factories that had originally hoped to produce his innovations. Omar Castellanos learned these details through his invisible presence at high-level meetings where damage assessments were read like casualty reports from an economic battlefield. The consulate's leadership began to understand that their employees' prejudice had not only violated ethical standards, but had also undermined American economic interests to the tune of tens of billions in lost revenue, foregone tax income, and abandoned technological advancement opportunities. The turning point arrived on a gray October morning when the State Department's Inspector General requested all security footage and communication records from the previous 6 months. The building's IT department, working under legal mandate, began retrieving archived files and backup recordings that most staff members had forgotten existed. Among these digital artifacts, carefully preserved in the system's memory like evidence waiting for Judgment Day, were the recordings of every visa interview, every discriminatory comment, every moment when prejudice had overruled procedure. Omar Castellanos, whose keys unlocked every door and whose clearance granted access to every system, became the curator of truth in preparation for its revelation. The security cameras he had helped maintain for 15 years had recorded everything. Brennan's casual bigotry during phone calls, his dismissive treatment of qualified applicants, his private jokes about camel jockeys and oil money, and most important, his deliberate ignoring of the Commerce Secretary's letter that should have guaranteed Omar al-Hassan's approval. As autumn deepened over Manhattan and the leaves in Central Park blazed like warning fires, the consulate braced for a reckoning that would transform not just individual careers, but the entire institutional culture. The wealth that flowed through these halls, measured in stock options and cryptocurrency portfolios, real estate empires and oil futures, had always seemed more important than the human dignity of those seeking entry to America. But digital truth was about to prove that the most valuable asset in any building was integrity, and that sometimes justice arrived wearing janitor's clothes and carrying 15 years of invisible observation. The moment of truth arrived with the subtle drama of dawn breaking over Manhattan's skyline, not with thunderous revelation, but with the quiet certainty of justice finally finding its voice. The Inspector General's team had completed their digital archaeology, unearthing months of recorded conversations and documented decisions that painted an unmistakable picture of systematic discrimination. The evidence was overwhelming. Hours of footage showing Brennan's differential treatment of applicants based on their ethnic backgrounds, recorded phone conversations revealing his prejudiced attitudes, and most damaging of all, security camera footage of him deliberately ignoring and then disposing of the Commerce Secretary's letter that vouched for Omar al-Hassan. Omar Castellanos received the news not through official channels, but through the building's invisible communication network, the conversations between security guards, the whispered updates from administrative assistants, the nervous energy that preceded major institutional changes. He was mopping the lobby's marble floors when he overheard two State Department investigators discussing the case that would prove pivotal to their report. The visa denial of a businessman whose legitimacy had been personally vouched for by a cabinet-level official, whose investment portfolio included partnerships with Fortune 500 companies, and whose rejection had cost American businesses an estimated $3 billion in lost opportunities. The investigators had spent weeks trying to locate the missing Commerce Secretary's letter, treating it as the cornerstone piece of evidence that would prove deliberate misconduct rather than simple bureaucratic error. Their search through archived files and backup systems had proved fruitless, leading them to conclude that the document might have been permanently destroyed. This uncertainty was creating legal complications that could potentially limit the scope of disciplinary actions against Brennan and others involved in the systematic discrimination. That afternoon, as autumn light filtered through the consulate's tall windows and painted golden rectangles on the floors he had cleaned 10,000 times, Omar Castellanos made the decision that 15 years of invisible service had prepared him for. He walked to Ambassador Whitman's office, knocked softly on her door, and when invited to enter, stood before her desk with the quiet dignity that had sustained him through decades of being unseen. In his weathered hands, he held the original Commerce Secretary's letter, preserved in pristine condition, along with copies of the document and a detailed timeline of when and where he had retrieved it. Ambassador Whitman's reaction to seeing the letter was immediate and profound. Her face cycled through surprise, relief, and then a growing understanding of the implications. The document she held represented not just vindication for Omar al-Hassan, but concrete proof of willful misconduct that could not be dismissed as procedural error or bureaucratic oversight. More importantly, it had been preserved and presented by the one person in the building whose integrity was beyond question, whose 15-year service record was spotless, and whose testimony would be unassailable in any formal proceeding. The revelation triggered a cascade of institutional changes that swept through the consulate like floodwater through city streets. Brennan was immediately suspended pending formal disciplinary proceedings, his access to visa processing systems permanently revoked. The cases of all Middle Eastern applicants rejected during his tenure were flagged for mandatory review by senior officers with specialized training in bias recognition and cultural sensitivity. Most significantly, the consulate implementing new oversight procedures that would make it impossible for any single officer to make unilateral decisions about applicants whose investments could significantly impact American economic interests. Within days, Omar al-Hassan received a personal call from Ambassador Whitman, extending a formal apology on behalf of the United States government and an invitation to resubmit his visa application with guaranteed expedited processing. The businessman's response, delivered with the same quiet dignity that Omar Castellanos had admired during his original visit, was gracious but firm. He would be honored to accept America's invitation, but only if the systemic changes being implemented would ensure that future applicants would not face the same discriminatory treatment that had nearly cost American businesses billions in lost investment opportunities. The investigation's findings, when released to the congressional committees overseeing State Department operations, sparked broader discussions about how unconscious bias and cultural prejudice could undermine America's economic competitiveness in an increasingly global marketplace. The consulate became a model for implementing anti-discrimination training and oversight procedures that were eventually adopted by diplomatic posts worldwide. Through all of these institutional transformations, Omar Castellanos continued his work with the same methodical precision he had maintained for 15 years. But his role in the building had fundamentally changed. No longer invisible, he had become a symbol of moral courage, whose quiet heroism had saved American businesses billions of dollars and restored the consulate's reputation for fair dealing with international investors, whose wealth could power economic growth for generations to come. The recognition came not with fanfare, but with the subtle respect accorded to someone whose integrity had proved more valuable than any stock portfolio or cryptocurrency fortune, whose 15 years of invisible service had culminated in one moment of visible courage that changed everything. Winter arrived in New York with the kind of crisp clarity that makes the city's steel and glass towers glitter like diamonds against the sky, and with it came a transformation at the consulate that would have been impossible to imagine just months before. Omar Castellanos found himself at the center of changes that rippled outward from his single act of moral courage, like waves spreading across still water. The building where he'd been invisible for 15 years now regarded him with a respect that felt almost surreal after so many years of being overlooked and undervalued. Ambassador Whitman had requested a private meeting with Omar in her office, the same space where powerful men and women discussed billion-dollar trade agreements and cryptocurrency investments that could shift entire markets. She sat across from him not as a superior speaking to a subordinate, but as one professional acknowledging another's crucial contribution to their shared mission. The Commerce Secretary's letter, now properly filed and copied for the official record, sat between them like evidence of justice finally served. "Omar," she said, using his first name with a respect that would have been unthinkable months earlier, "your actions have saved this institution's reputation and protected American economic interests worth billions of dollars. The State Department wants to formally recognize your service, but more than that, we want to learn from what happened here. Would you be willing to help us develop training programs to ensure this never happens again?" The offer represented more than professional advancement. It was an invitation to transform from invisible observer to active guardian of institutional integrity. Omar would work with State Department trainers to develop sensitivity protocols for diplomatic staff, help design oversight systems that prevented discrimination from masquerading as procedure, and serve as a living example of how moral courage could triumph over systematic prejudice. His salary would increase substantially, reflecting his new responsibilities, but more importantly, his voice would finally be heard by people whose decisions affected international relationships worth trillions of dollars. Omar al-Hassan returned to the consulate on a bright February morning, his previous humiliation transformed into a moment of institutional redemption. Ambassador Whitman personally processed his visa application, a gesture that acknowledged not just his individual worth, but America's renewed commitment to judging visitors by their character and contributions rather than their ethnicity or religion. The businessman's investment plans, temporarily derailed by prejudice, would now proceed with full American support. His pharmaceutical research facilities would create thousands of American jobs. His technology partnerships would strengthen domestic innovation capabilities, and his renewable energy projects would reduce American dependence on foreign oil by an estimated 15% over 5 years. The reunion between the two Omars, janitor and businessman, took place in the same marble lobby where discrimination had once prevailed. They spoke in Arabic, the language that connected their shared heritage, while Omar Castellanos explained how he had preserved the crucial letter and why he had chosen to speak out. Omar al-Hassan listened with the respect one man of dignity shows another, understanding that the janitor's quiet heroism had cost him nothing less than his comfortable invisibility and the safety of being overlooked. "Why did you risk so much for someone you barely knew?" Omar al-Hassan asked, genuinely curious about the moral calculus that had motivated such courage. Omar Castellanos smiled with the wisdom of someone who had spent 15 years observing human nature in its finest and worst forms. "Because dignity is not for sale," he replied. "I have seen too much wealth in this building. Men worth hundreds of millions, cryptocurrency fortunes that could buy entire neighborhoods, stock portfolios that control major corporations. But I have learned that money cannot purchase respect, and power cannot guarantee justice. Sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply refuse to let injustice happen in their presence." The conversation between them attracted attention from other staff members, diplomats, and visitors who had witnessed the consulate's transformation. Word spread through the building's informal networks about the janitor who had saved the institution and the businessman whose dignity had never wavered despite discriminatory treatment. Their story became a teaching example used in diplomatic training programs, a reminder that integrity could emerge from unexpected sources and that justice sometimes arrived wearing work clothes and speaking softly. Omar al-Hassan's successful visa processing opened doors for dozens of other qualified applicants who had been rejected during Brennan's tenure. The pharmaceutical executive returned to establish research facilities in 3 American cities. The artificial intelligence researcher partnered with MIT to develop medical diagnostic systems that would save millions of lives worldwide. The solar energy entrepreneur built manufacturing plants in Michigan that employed thousands of workers and competed successfully with Chinese manufacturers for global market share. The economic impact of these approvals, measured in job creation, technological advancement, and international competitiveness, exceeded $50 billion over the following 5 years. American universities attracted billions in research funding from Middle Eastern investors who had previously been discouraged by bureaucratic hostility. Cryptocurrency entrepreneurs who had considered relocating to more welcoming countries decided to keep their blockchain innovations in American markets, contributing hundreds of millions in tax revenue and maintaining American leadership in financial technology development. Through all of these transformations, Omar Castellanos remained grounded in the values that had sustained him through 15 years of invisible service. His promotion brought him respect and financial security, but it had not changed his fundamental character. He still arrived early, still treated every person with courtesy regardless of their wealth or status, still understood that true power came from serving others rather than commanding them. The years that followed transformed the consulate into a model of fair dealing and cultural sensitivity, attracting praise from business leaders, diplomatic colleagues, and international partners who had previously questioned American commitment to equal treatment. Omar Castellanos, once invisible, had become the institution's moral compass, proving that sometimes the most important person in any building is the one who cleans its floors and guards its integrity with quiet, unwavering dedication. 5 years later, on a spring morning when cherry blossoms bloomed in Central Park and the city hummed with the energy of renewal and possibility, Omar Castellanos stood in the same marble lobby where his journey from invisibility to recognition had begun. The consulate around him had evolved into something unrecognizable from the institution, where discrimination had once masqueraded as procedure and prejudice had cost America billions in lost opportunities. The walls that had witnessed systematic racism now displayed certificates of excellence from international business organizations and letters of appreciation from heads of state whose citizens could now expect fair treatment when seeking to contribute their talents and wealth to American prosperity. The building's daily rhythm had transformed as well. Where harsh voices had once dismissed qualified applicants based on their ethnic backgrounds, trained professionals now conducted interviews with cultural sensitivity and institutional oversight that ensured each case received fair evaluation based on merit rather than bias. The marble floors that Omar had cleaned while remaining invisible now reflected the faces of diverse applicants whose combined wealth, measured in everything from traditional investments to cutting-edge cryptocurrency portfolios, exceeded $500 billion annually. Omar himself had aged gracefully into his role as the consulate's Director of Cultural Relations and Institutional Integrity, a position created specifically to honor his contributions and ensure that the lessons learned from David Brennan's discriminatory practices would be permanently embedded in the building's operational culture. His office, modest but respected, occupied a space near the main lobby where he could observe the daily flow of international relationships being built and maintained through fair, dignified treatment of all visitors, regardless of their backgrounds or beliefs. The economic impact of the consulate's transformation had exceeded even optimistic projections. American businesses had gained access to Middle Eastern markets worth over $200 billion annually. Technology partnerships initiated through fairly processed visa applications had positioned American companies at the forefront of renewable energy development, medical research, and financial innovation. The pharmaceutical facilities established by previously rejected applicants had developed breakthrough treatments for diseases affecting millions worldwide, generating both humanitarian achievements and significant economic returns that strengthened American leadership in global healthcare markets. Perhaps most importantly, the consulate's reputation for fair dealing had attracted investment from sovereign wealth funds managing trillions in assets, cryptocurrency billionaires seeking stable regulatory environments for blockchain innovation, and traditional business people whose confidence in American institutions had been restored by evidence that merit rather than prejudice governed official decisions. The building that had once cost America billions through systematic discrimination now generated hundreds of billions in economic activity through its commitment to equal treatment and cultural respect. Omar often reflected on the journey that had brought him from invisible janitor to respected institutional leader, understanding that his transformation represented something larger than individual advancement. His story had become part of the training curriculum for diplomatic personnel worldwide, taught as an example of how moral courage could emerge from unexpected sources and how speaking truth to power sometimes required nothing more dramatic than refusing to remain silent in the face of injustice. The relationships he had built during his 15 years of invisible service had evolved into networks of mutual respect that strengthened American diplomatic effectiveness around the world. Former visitors who had witnessed his quiet dignity returned as ambassadors and business leaders who specifically requested meetings at the consulate because they trusted its commitment to fair dealing. Omar al-Hassan had become not just a successful visa recipient, but a bridge between American and Middle Eastern business communities, facilitating partnerships that generated billions in mutual economic benefits. On quiet evenings, when the diplomatic building emptied and Omar prepared to lock the doors one final time each day, he sometimes paused in the marble lobby to remember the morning when one man's humiliation had ignited his conscience and changed everything. The security cameras that had once recorded systematic discrimination now captured daily examples of respectful international cooperation. The floors he had cleaned while invisible now supported meetings between leaders whose decisions affected global markets worth trillions of dollars. His wife, Maria, proud of his transformation, but ultimately unsurprised by his moral courage, often reminded him that true strength had always resided in his character rather than his position. "You were never invisible to the people who mattered," she would say during their evening conversations in their now comfortable Queen's apartment, purchased with the savings from his increased salary, but furnished with the same modest values that had sustained them through decades of financial struggle. The city outside continued its relentless pursuit of wealth and power, but inside the consulate, Omar had proven that the most valuable currency in any institution was integrity, and that sometimes the most powerful person in any building was the one who had spent years observing it quietly, understanding its true nature, and maintaining the courage to speak when silence would have been easier, but infinitely more costly. As Omar prepared for retirement, he took pride not just in his personal journey from invisibility to recognition, but in the institutional transformation that would continue long after his service ended. The procedures he had helped develop would protect future generations of applicants from discriminatory treatment. The cultural sensitivity training he had designed would ensure that wealth and opportunity flowed to America from every corner of the world, regardless of the ethnic or religious backgrounds of those bringing their talents and investments to strengthen the nation's economy. The marble floors of the consulate would outlast them all: Omar, the diplomats, the wealthy applicants, and even the building's current purpose. But they would forever bear witness to the truth that justice sometimes arrives wearing janitor's clothes, speaking softly, and carrying 15 years of patient observation that finally found its voice when human dignity demanded that silence was no longer acceptable. And you, listening to this story wherever you are, perhaps finishing your shift in an office building, checking the security monitors one last time, or preparing to lock the doors of another day's service. Have you ever felt invisible while holding everything together? Have you witnessed injustice and wondered whether your voice could make a difference? Tell me your story in the comments below. Because every person who has been overlooked, underestimated, or ignored deserves to be seen and heard. Omar's journey from invisible janitor to institutional leader proves that dignity cannot be purchased with any amount of money, whether counted in dollars, stock options, real estate portfolios, or cryptocurrency fortunes. The most valuable assets in any building are integrity, courage, and the willingness to speak truth to power when human dignity is at stake. The ripple effects of Omar's courage continued to spread far beyond the marble halls of the consulate, reaching into boardrooms in Dubai where sheikhs discussed billion-dollar investment strategies, echoing through Silicon Valley conference rooms where cryptocurrency pioneers planned their next ventures, and resonating in the corridors of power in Washington, where policymakers began to understand the true cost of institutional prejudice. The story of two Omars, one wealthy, one humble, both dignified, became a case study taught in business schools, diplomatic academies, and ethics courses around the world. The pharmaceutical executive whose visa had been unfairly denied eventually established research facilities not just in America, but across 3 continents, creating a medical research network that developed breakthrough treatments for diseases that had plagued humanity for generations. His company's stock value rose to exceed $30 billion. But more importantly, his innovations saved millions of lives and demonstrated how American openness to international talent could generate benefits that couldn't be measured in mere financial terms. The artificial intelligence researcher whose family had been questioned about their political beliefs became a pioneer in diagnostic medicine, his algorithms detecting cancers and neurological conditions years before traditional methods could identify them. Omar Castellanos, now approaching his 70th birthday, had watched his small act of moral courage bloom into an international movement toward greater institutional accountability and cultural sensitivity. The training programs he helped develop had been implemented in over 50 countries, creating new standards for diplomatic engagement that prioritized human dignity alongside economic considerations. His salary in his new position allowed him and Maria to purchase a comfortable home in Astoria, Queens, within sight of the Manhattan skyline that had dominated their view for so many years of struggle and hope. But perhaps the most profound change was the transformation of the consulate's culture itself. The marble lobby that had once echoed with the cold formality of bureaucratic power now hummed with the warm energy of genuine service. Young diplomats arriving for their first assignments specifically requested posting to the New York consulate, knowing it had become a laboratory for innovative approaches to international relations. The building's reputation attracted delegations from around the world who came to study its methods and implement similar reforms in their own institutions. The economic impact of these changes continued to compound like interest in a well-managed investment account. American businesses gained access to emerging markets worth hundreds of billions, while foreign investors found welcoming pathways to contribute their capital and expertise to American economic growth. The cryptocurrency sector, particularly sensitive to regulatory attitudes and institutional trust, saw unprecedented collaboration between American and international partners, with blockchain innovations worth trillions in potential economic value being developed through partnerships that might never have existed under the previous discriminatory regime. Omar al-Hassan, whose rejection had sparked this institutional revolution, became a bridge between worlds, facilitating business relationships that generated prosperity on multiple continents. His pharmaceutical company partnered with American research universities to develop treatments for rare diseases affecting children worldwide. His renewable energy investments helped American manufacturers compete with Chinese solar panel producers, creating thousands of jobs in Michigan and Ohio while advancing global efforts to combat climate change. His cryptocurrency ventures funded startup companies that revolutionized everything from medical records management to supply chain transparency. But Omar Castellanos never forgot that behind every statistic about economic growth and international cooperation stood human beings whose dreams and dignity deserved protection regardless of their wealth or status. His office wall displayed not certificates of recognition or photos with famous politicians, but letters from visa applicants whose lives had been changed by fair treatment. A grandmother finally granted permission to attend her grandson's graduation in America. A young entrepreneur whose innovative water purification system would bring clean drinking water to millions of people in developing countries. A professor whose research into sustainable agriculture could help feed the world's growing population. During his final months of service before retirement, Omar instituted a tradition that would outlive his tenure. Every Friday afternoon, he would spend an hour in the marble lobby, available to speak with any visitor who had concerns about their treatment or questions about the visa process. These conversations, conducted in English, Spanish, Arabic, or any of the 6 languages he had learned during his decades of service, became legendary among the international business community. Billionaires and paupers alike found themselves receiving the same respectful attention, the same careful consideration of their concerns, the same assurance that their dignity mattered more than their bank account balance. The approach attracted attention from major media outlets, which began featuring stories about the transformed consulate and the janitor-turned-diplomat whose moral courage had prevented America from losing hundreds of billions in investment opportunities. The New York Times published a feature story titled "The Invisible Man Who Saved America Billions," while Forbes magazine included Omar Castellanos in their annual list of most influential people in international business, noting that his actions had generated more economic value than those of most Fortune 500 CEOs. But Omar remained focused on the human element that had always motivated his service. He established a scholarship fund for the children of service workers in diplomatic buildings worldwide, understanding that education could provide pathways out of invisibility for future generations. The fund, seeded with donations from grateful business people whose visas had been processed fairly, grew to support thousands of young people pursuing degrees in international relations, business, and public service. As Omar's retirement approached, the consulate organized a farewell ceremony that brought together representatives from dozens of countries, business leaders worth collectively trillions of dollars, and service workers from buildings throughout Manhattan. The speakers included ambassadors and janitors, cryptocurrency billionaires and security guards, each testifying to how Omar's example had influenced their own approach to treating others with dignity and respect. Omar al-Hassan delivered the keynote address, speaking not about his business achievements or his billions in assets, but about the lesson he had learned from watching another Omar transform injustice into opportunity through quiet courage. Money can buy many things, he told the assembled crowd, but it cannot purchase integrity, it cannot acquire honor, and it cannot secure the respect that comes from treating every human being as valuable, regardless of their circumstances. Omar Castellanos taught me that true wealth lies not in what we own, but in how we treat others, especially when we think no one is watching. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a plaque in the marble lobby, inscribed with words chosen by Omar himself. Justice requires no wealth, demands no status, seeks no recognition. It asks only that we see each other's humanity and refuse to let dignity be for sale. The plaque would serve as a daily reminder to future generations of diplomats and visitors that the most important transactions conducted in the building had nothing to do with money or power, but with honor, respect, and the courage to do what was right, even when it was difficult. On his final day of work, Omar Castellanos arrived at 5 in the morning as he had done for 20 years, unlocking doors and preparing the building for another day of international cooperation. But this time, he was accompanied by his replacement, a young woman named Sofia Rodriguez, whose parents had immigrated from Guatemala and worked as custodians in office buildings throughout Queens. Sofia had earned her degree in international studies through evening classes while working full-time, and Omar had personally recommended her for the position of Assistant Director of Cultural Relations. As Omar handed Sofia the keys to the building, the same keys he had carried for 2 decades, he shared the wisdom that years of invisible observation had taught him. "These keys don't just open doors," he told her. "They unlock opportunities to serve others, chances to witness both the best and worst of human nature, and moments when you might be called upon to speak for those who have no voice. The building belongs to the people who need its services, not to those who work within its walls. Remember that dignity is the most valuable currency we handle here, and it must never be allowed to lose its value." Sofia nodded with the reverence of someone accepting a sacred trust, understanding that she was inheriting not just a job, but a legacy of moral courage that had transformed an institution and influenced international relations on a global scale. The marble floors she would now help maintain had witnessed discrimination transform into justice, invisibility become influence, and quiet service evolve into profound impact. As Omar walked through the lobby one final time as an employee of the consulate, he paused to touch the plaque bearing his chosen words about justice and dignity. 20 years earlier, he had entered this building as an invisible janitor, hoping only for steady work and fair treatment. He was leaving as a respected leader whose moral courage had saved America billions of dollars, transformed institutional practices worldwide, and proved that heroism sometimes carried a mop instead of a sword, spoke softly instead of shouting, and changed the world through patient service rather than dramatic gestures. The city outside continued its eternal dance of ambition and opportunity, with new fortunes being made in cryptocurrency markets, oil futures, real estate empires, and technological innovations that would reshape how humans lived and worked. But inside the consulate, the marble floors now reflected a different kind of wealth, the accumulated dignity of 20 years of faithful service, the compound interest of moral courage applied daily, and the most valuable return on investment any institution could generate. The trust and respect of people whose dreams and dignity had been protected by someone who understood that being unseen was sometimes the most powerful position of all. Omar Castellanos stepped into his retirement knowing that he had lived his life in service to something greater than personal advancement or financial gain. He had served justice itself, becoming its quiet guardian in a building where wealth and power converged, but where human dignity had once been treated as expendable. His legacy would continue through every fair visa decision, every respectful interaction, every moment when institutional power chose to serve human dignity rather than exploit human vulnerability. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe so it reaches someone else who deserves to be seen for their quiet strength and moral courage. Hit the notification bell to join other listeners who believe that the most important people in any institution are often those who serve it with humble dedication while maintaining their principles regardless of personal cost. For more stories that honor the dignity of service and the power of quiet heroism, tap the podcast link on the left. Thank you for walking this journey with us from invisibility to recognition, from silence to justice, from being overlooked to being irreplaceable. Remember, sometimes the most powerful person in any room is the one nobody bothered to notice until the moment their conscience demanded that justice could no longer wait. We'll see you in the next story, where ordinary people prove that extraordinary courage can emerge from the most unexpected places when human dignity is on the line.